insurgency, a terrorist insurgency. And unlike I'd say in some other cases, I don't think that they had a major state backer, right? So and I'm sure you talk about this a lot about proxy warfare and different organizations having a unknown, but we all know who it is, backer, a different nation, giving them weapons, giving them knowledge, training, everything. ISIS, I don't think fell in that category. So I don't personally call this a state-on-state operation against ISIS. ISIS was just a really big terrorist organization that was allowed to get out of control in both Syria and in Iraq. And there are reasons that happened, and hopefully we learn the lessons. But it was a glorified terrorist insurgency.
Yes, but taking into account, the complex structure that they were able to, that ISIS was able to develop, how do you think that it affected their ability to fortify, to mobilize resources in order to prepare the battle?
Yeah, I mean, like we talked about, I mean, I would give them credit with limited means establishing a strong defense that did cause a nation state, Iraq, a lot of problems, especially in the first few months of the operation, as you see the different coalition partners giving more resources, giving more capabilities. And there were, unfortunately, a lot of deaths because of this. But still, if you were to take a different organization like ISIS and just throw them in a city and say, hey, for 2 years, figure out how to defend this city, I think that they would equally make it hard for a military to do the operation. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I mean, they didn't
Yes, yes.
have, yes, they didn't have military capabilities. And that's kind of one of the arguments that we'll say, yeah, they captured a lot of military equipment when they took over the different cities that they did. So even if you look at like Taliban today, but your Taliban to me is a terrorist organization as well. And despite the equipment that they have, they're not going to fight well, even if you give them a lot of time to defend cities.
Yes, so just let me tell for our audience who is joining us, Mr. Spencer said that the two key lessons for Western militaries are we could say the numbers intensive, right, character of urban warfare, and also the time. Time, of course, is against the strategic level of war, but also against the tactical level, right? You won't need surprise, but ISIS has 2 years to fortify, right, his city. Then we also speak about the intergovernmental, interagency, multinational operations, and he told us that the focus should be on intergovernmental, right? That is the hardest thing to get. And finally, we know the complex character, right, of ISIS. Let's continue and let's go into detail about the battle TTPs, we could say. What can we learn from them? And I would like to ask you some very personal question, because in Spain there is a debate and a lot of people think the next. Tanks must never be used in cities. So I would like to ask you, should tanks be used in cities, or are they death traps like in Grozny? Or
Yeah, so I get this a lot, and I write about this a lot, Yago. Anybody who says that tanks shouldn't be used in urban warfare or are too vulnerable just haven't been in urban fights. So I've personally been in urban fights, and I've been studying it for years, years and years. The tank is an essential piece of equipment in high intensity urban combat, right? So urban warfare, people imagine different types of fight. Battles like this, the Battle of Mosul, the Battle of Mawari, all these battles that we've seen in the last 10, 15 years only further emphasize that if you don't have that mobile protective firepower of a tank and use it correctly, then you're going to cost a lot of people lives. It's going to take you a lot more time, and you may fail your mission. Sure, there's been lots of lessons learned, like in the Battle of First Grozny, the Battle of Suez City, 1973, that if you don't use the tank in a combined arms fight, right? So you have to have infantry just like in an urban fight, just as much as you have to have a tank. You have to have all your capabilities brought together at the right time but a tank has to be one of those pieces for its protection, for its ability to penetrate concrete, especially in these high intensity fights. And I unfortunately see what you're seeing in whether it's the Spanish military or the UK military or even the US Marines who believe that either they won't be fighting in urban, or if they do, they'll have the time to bring in all the right capabilities. I think it's a really bad trend we see about people thinking about the future, despite these last 20 years of urban fighting. If you don't have a tank, I strongly believe you're going to cost people lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I still remember in having this debate, and even the Filipino army, who doesn't even have a main battle tank, they use their Scorpion light tanks. You know, everything with armor they were able to get in Marawi, they get it and they use it, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, and I
And
mean, even in the Nagorno-Karabakh war that I've studied a lot, that people try to use as the new way of warfare, right? These drones that can strike anything in the open, that can strike a tank, right? That's just an argument that you need a full suite of capabilities. You better have a protection system on your tank, kind of like the Israeli trophy that can shoot down RPGs, right? If you send a tank in by itself into a city, it's vulnerable to any RPG if it doesn't have if it's not being used in the right way, combined arms maneuver, or have a protection system and have an aerial protection system. Of course, any piece of equipment is going to be vulnerable. But the fact with the Nagorno Karabakh war is that the urban fight was the only battle that mattered, and tanks did come into play in that urban fight. It wasn't all this high speed technology that means that the tank of the is in this future fight that we all want to imagine it won't be needed. It'll be needed more than ever.
yeah, absolutely agree. And if you let me add this, if I don't remember bad, when in the first 10 days of the war, when the Azeris were trying to break through the Armenian defenses at Fusuli, that was the key point where the breakthrough was going to happen, and the Armenians were through in their tanks and launching counterattacks. And that was really a key part of the battle. And in the end, you know, if an armored piece of 50 tons is vulnerable, what about a person with blood and skin, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's the problem. It's stop imagining warfare in the way you want it to fight. War is going to happen the way it always has. Each side trying to beat the other side's capabilities. You have to have a full suite of capabilities. If you don't have one, as we saw in the Nagorno-Karabakh war, if you don't have a strong anti-air capability, then it'll be exposed, and you'll pay the price.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what about the, you know, we all hear these BBIEDs, but for me it's a little bit complicated to pronounce it. So let's call them car bomb vehicles or something like that. So what about bomb vehicles? What paper did they have in ISIS arsenal? How important were they? How effective?
Yes, they were. So ISIS tried to use anything that they could to their advantage. The way they set their defense up, and a very strong way of how they built their actual defenses were concrete. That caused a lot of problems because you have to be able to breach that. But this one of the main sources of their weapons, right? So they're not a military, so they don't have weapons that the military is coming to bear. So they invested heavily in car bombs, basically. In if somebody imagine that into their mind, don't think of like a sedan or a Yugo or a small vehicle. I mean, they put bombs inside of bulldozers and dump trucks and launched and just drove them at the attackers, right? Because that's the advantage that you have as a defender of a city is you know where the attackers are usually coming from. There's great ways to deceive people in that. But anytime they knew where the Iraqi army was, they were driving this fleet of suicide bomb vehicles, these car bombs at the Iraqi military, and they had a lot of success, unfortunately, especially in the beginning. Because they surprised everybody by the number of these that they basically established factories, and they put out hundreds and hundreds of these car bombs. And the different numbers right now, we estimate about 480-ish car bombs were blown by ISIS against the Iraqi forces in this operation in Mosul. But especially in the beginning, they had catastrophic effect where they were just driving these vehicles into the Iraqi formations that were trying to get into the city, and they used drones to video that footage, which just helps in their kind of their campaign of information operations. They use these new drones with cameras to help the vehicle get to the Iraq where the Iraqi military, avoid the roads that were closed, and they also videotaped the actual attacks that were successful. Of course, a lot of them weren't successful, but it actually gets into the mind of the soldier if they think that these car bombs are being so successful. But it was a major part of their arsenal, their weapons, their capabilities for ISIS to put all these vehicle bombs out, and it was really hard to defeat. So you have to argue, even if you're a very strong military in this close urban fight, right? So everyone wants to fight as far out as possible, and they're going to destroy you with all their aircraft and joint fires. But in this close fight of the urban terrain, since you have to take the city back, you're very vulnerable to lots of things, to include cars coming at you full of bombs. So you have to look at what capabilities do you have to stop a car coming at you. And they trial and error. They used a lot of different techniques, everything from, an AT-4, an anti-tank man portable weapons to shoot at the vehicle bombs if they knew what that was happening. So you have to have the aero assets to see beyond where you are to know there's a vehicle coming your way. To even where they just started using bulldozers at night. Anytime they stopped, they create a berm in front of them so that the vehicle couldn't get at them if they had stopped for any amount of time, or even dropping bombs in intersections of roads to create craters, so the vehicle couldn't get at the friendly or your forces with this vehicle bomb. All this also adds to the collateral damage of the operation, right? So you drop a bomb in a four-way intersection to create a crater to stop a vehicle bomb. You're going to destroy lots of buildings when you do that. So it just gets to this cost of the operation. But yeah, the vehicle bombs were in this operation so huge to the enemy's capabilities.
Wow. Now let me remind the Spaniard audience. Ya pondré los subtítulos en español, no os preocupéis. Esto en cuanto acabe el vídeo va a estar en español los subtítulos. Es una excepción, pero bueno, creo que merece la pena con tal de poder escuchar a John Spencer. Okay, so one question, it comes to my mind. I do not want to ask you too much about your personal battle experience, but I wonder if you saw some car bombs activity when you were in the battlefield, we could say, and how does it contrast, or what's the evolution from that time to the Mosul, to what you have researched about Mosul, if it is not too complex?
No, not too complex. So I had two war deployments in my 25 years. The first one was 2003, Iraq for the invasion, and then I was a platoon leader. And in 2008, I was in the Battle of Cyril City as a company commander. So with tanks, Bradleys, infantry. So the evolution of the car bomb, right? And that gets to context. I always tell people when you say urban warfare, like what do you hold in your mind as your vision of urban warfare? Is it more of a counterinsurgency, counter-terrorist fight, or is what we're talking about in Mosul is a full-scale, high-intensity urban battle, more like battles of World War II than anything else. So if you talk about the context of a car bomb in counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, they have to work really hard to deceive security forces, police and military, of what's in the car. In the Battle of Mosul, this is a different fight. This is a high intensity. They didn't have to deceive anybody about what the car was. So they actually created armored vehicles and created almost the movie Mad Max looking vehicles, and encased them in armor, in steel, just so they could drive as close to the military as they could. That's a lot different than like when I was in all my fights. We're usually in a counterinsurgency, counter-terrorist fight. Even the Battle of Sadr City, which was a major battle, they were more disguised. You didn't know if the vehicle on the street was a car bomb. In the Battle of Mosul, there's a giant dump truck or vehicle encased in steel just trying to get to you. Big difference in the two. Of course, I had car bombs explode on me in combat, but nothing at this scale that we're talking about in the Battle of Mosul.
Mm. So sorry for being so detailed, but do you think there's an evolution, or it is just a completely different thing, or there was an evolution and they learned from those counterinsurgency, terrorist actions, and they evolved it to use it in the battlefield? Sorry, maybe it
No,
is
no,
too
it's a great question. No, I think it's a great question. Yeah, of course, I think that ISIS learned from the years of fighting in Iraq war, and did see the evolution of IEDs, right? So explosive bombs. So they're not military bombs. They're bombs that are put together with different types of material. And because of the wars in Iraq specifically, and the use and let's call it like it is, the heavy influence of Iran teaching insurgents how to build bombs. Mosul is almost a culmination of that. I will agree with you, of 20 years of learning how to build bombs and then put them inside of vehicles, right? So it's just a bomb inside of a vehicle, but they've learned from decades of trying to attack U.S. and Iraqi forces with different types of bombs, and we saw that evolution, of course, in Iraq and that in Mosul. So you're facing a different type of bomb, a different type of car bomb, a very high explosive, casualty producing bomb. And the same thing with IEDs. IEDs were a huge part of the Battle of Mosul as well, which was the evolution of IEDs from the beginning, right? From 2003 all the way up to 2017. So the types of bombs that the Iraqi military was facing were highly highly developed types of bombs.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry if I am too,
No, no, I have no problem. I'll answer any question.
All right, so we are an insurgency. Let's say we have the insurgency mindset. We know that we will be punched by American or whatever air power, right? Even if I am in Syria, the Syrian Air Force or whatever. So I develop a lot of tactics, especially against Western Air Force, right? So ISIS get this smoke, burning tires, all kind of decoys, diversion tactics. I know it is maybe a little bit difficult, but how were they effective? Is it possible to be effective using tunnels and all of that, or what do you think on this question?
Yeah,
And what
absolutely.
effort they did to on this regard?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and it's something I talk about often, and we don't study enough. What if we have to defend the city? We being any military, we again we hold these assumptions about what the future of war will be, and we're always attacking, and we're always in the open, and the enemy is far out. So if you look at how ISIS defended the city, and what did they do that worked and what didn't work, and they did a lot of things that worked very well for them as defenders, even against the Western most sophisticated military in the world. Um, like you mentioned, tunnels underneath buildings. So if I was that across history, and especially in urban terrain, gives you amazing capabilities to avoid the air power of the other force that is attacking you. If you can build tunnels between your houses and just move from house to house by never presenting yourself on the street, you put holes in your walls, they call them mouse holes, so you can move through the streets, so that even with the most advanced precision guided munitions or aerial assets that can target a building, you just, as soon as they target, you move to the next building. And same thing with, we all know that everybody can see usually above you. So seeing into the city is one thing, striking into the city is another. So how can you, what we say, degrade the other person, the attacker's ability to see you, right? And ISIS did this in multiple cities where they just put things, your pieces of tin across the building tops, so they can move between buildings so you can't see them. And it does work. It is effective. Of course, you can have, there's thermals and things like that, but all these, the urban terrain is already the hardest terrain to fight in the world. You can make it because of the physical structure, right? So the buildings close together, the underground, all those aspects that make it really hard for a military to see inside the city and strike it without, you want them to get close to you. That's what you want. You don't want them to strike you from far away. It doesn't matter if you're a good guy or bad guy. So you close that distance. All that, I think, so all that, the burning of the tires, maybe that works a little bit, maybe that doesn't. But um, what ISIS also did, and we have to call it out. So ISIS doesn't follow the law of armed conflict, right? So they're using civilians because they know that any attacker, most militaries will follow the laws of armed conflict, will do everything they can to reduce civilian casualties. So the ISIS uses, as a terrorist organization, put civilians anywhere they could around them. They were trapping civilians at checkpoints. They were filling buildings with civilians and putting snipers on top of buildings because they know that anybody who knows there are civilian presence, they won't fire. There's a lot less they can do. Uh, that's can I say that's effective? And of course, I won't say that's effective, but they knew what they were doing by using the laws of armed conflict against the attackers because they're just terrible people. They're not following any even humane things that they were doing. So I hope that answered some of the questions. So this definitely the underground is huge. Just so what I usually tell people, if you're a defender in a city, you better start digging. So dig underneath, connect your buildings, put holes through walls, and have plans to move a lot within the city. And ISIS did that. ISIS also, which didn't get a lot of news, built really effective obstacles. Uh, so we always in military training we practice what we call a breach. Getting into the city, getting past the defenses. Uh, ISIS built really effective obstacles everywhere in the city that did cause the military, the Iraqi military specifically, a lot of trouble just getting into the city. And they put up these giant obstacles, and then they would fire at whoever is trying to get through the obstacle, whether you're a tank or whatever. And that we call that combined arms breach. It's really hard to learn. It's really hard to practice. So much so that you can't even get into the city, and they're killing you because they put up such a big obstacle using concrete, which is already in the city environment. That was another thing they did that you don't need a lot of capabilities to do that becomes very effective.
Um, Now, what about the electronic warfare? Right, maybe since the Ukraine war, we are speaking much more about electronic warfare and all of that. How important it was? Was it that important? What do you think? Because we don't tend to know a lot of things about the usage of this kind of way of warfare. But if you can tell us a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great question, especially because it's the one area of, I guess, research that it's hard to get to because it usually has a classification, right? We kind of know what people have. We kind of know they're using it in a battle. I'm a civilian now, so everything I do is unclassified. I don't do in secret work anymore. Um, Even in Nagorno Karabakh, we know if a piece of equipment's on the battlefield that what it's supposed to be doing. In the Battle of Mosul specifically, I personally, of course, the electronic warfare in the counter explosive realm. So, we know that an IED needs to sometimes electronic signature or the electronic ability to explode. And that's kind of well known that most militaries are going to field some way to stop those things from going off if they're using electronic signature, these counter IED capabilities. But and I know this is kind of related to your question, is this the drone, right? So the civilian drone aspect to the battle. And there is a heavy electronic warfare aspect to that drone. But I think especially 2014, but even all the way up to the Battle of Mosul, uh, the Iraqi military was fielded with not a lot of electronic warfare capability, especially for the aerial, to where you had a civilian DJI drone causing them a lot of problems. And I'll argue causing the U.S. military a lot of problems. And we say this in the article. It kind of woke everybody up that you better have a counter electronic warfare capability to just counter that level of aerial asset, right? So, civilian drones don't fly that high, right? So usually when you think about electronic warfare at a higher realm in what we call there's a bunch of different military terms to it, but you're usually thinking higher up on those capabilities. This little civilian drone that can fly around different aspects, not many people had an electronic warfare answer to that or had an answer to the drone at all. This battle kind of woke everybody up that we all need a counter UAV assets, and electronic warfare is a major component of that. And you saw as the battle went on, as stuff was just being rushed to the battlefield. Now, if you put information warfare into that, as in electronic means trying to suppress the defender's ability to communicate to him, there is always that, right? So you always want to prevent the enemy from communicating to its forces. And they do things to what we call break up themselves, so that they don't have to communicate to their forces. And that's a really good tactic to defenders, is don't require communications, because usually in electronic warfare, we're going to cut off your ability to communicate. So back then there's WhatsApp and things like that are being used. So there's always going to be that element of electronic warfare where you're trying to interdict or to stop that and like cut it off. But you see ISIS during this time, they're still tweeting out that they're doing great, and you see the Iraqi military say, "No, you're not." We saw this in the Nagorno-Karabakh war as well. I would put that in the realm of electronic warfare. So that was an aspect, right, of this battle as well. But I think it gets very specific to these drones that were used during the battle, and your electronic warfare ability to stop those or other means. You can shoot at them, and this battle, like, what can you do? And like everything from a hawk being launched to shotguns to an electronic thing that kind of brings it down, or all these different options. This battle, and it went for 9 months, really exposed where there are gaps, especially if you're not this highly sophisticated army. But even if you are this highly sophisticated army who is designed for one type of threat in the air or in the electronic magnetic spectrum, as we say, this terrorist organization was able to grab some civilian stuff and cause you some problems.
Now, a question from the audience. Mr. AG is asking, what about the leadership of Abdul Jarallah? What was his paper during this battle?
Who is it?
Abdul Jarallah.
Is that the? I don't know. So that my answer. I don't. I didn't.
Sorry.
No problem at all.
Maybe he didn't wrote it well, or to be fair, I didn't know who is he. Maybe sorry.
And
okay,
I will say
let's
I'm
pass.
not. I'm not an expert in the ISIS organization, and I get that question a lot about the leadership. And wasn't this just a fight without the leadership of the, or even in the Iraqi military? We put one leader in the Iraqi military. Of course, there are hundreds of leaders, and especially in the counterterrorism service, that were part of this fight.
Okay, yeah, maybe it's Abdul Amir Rashid Jarallah. Okay, no, sorry, maybe my fair. Sorry.
No, it could be me. I'm terrible at like the organization of ISIS. I couldn't even tell you who was the ISIS lead in the battle.
No problem.
Abu
No
Bakr
problem. Sorry.
No problem.
Okay, next question. What about the training in Western militaries? How do we connect, if we connect at all, the lessons learned from these kind of battles and the training? Yeah. What about the OP4 units?
Yeah, no, it's excellent question, and I do a lot of time with this, traveling the world. I want to see what are the sites, like the physical locations that we can use to do this type of training. Most of them for us are out in the middle of the desert, and we build like this mock city. But I think that's a great question. Okay, who are you putting as your opposing force, and how are they acting? Of course, usually we put ourselves, right? So we just take a unit from ourselves and we tell them, okay, you're the bad guys, go into the city and build your defense or whatever. Some people are a little bit better than others at that. But here's the problem. I rarely see them doing what, like we saw with ISIS, is doing. Because when we practice urban warfare, we always want it to be fast, right? So because we don't have a lot of time for training. Usually the op 4 inside the city will just shoot at the people attacking. Um, and two easy things, two fixes for that I think I never see, but of course in Mosul and all the other battles we see is one is obstacles. You never see the person inside who's acting like the enemy setting up these real big obstacles even inside the city. Usually you put they always replicate it by putting it on the outside of the city. But if you talk like this battle, or even go way back like the Battle of Berlin, every street was blocked in some way by the defenders. You have to have the ability to deal with obstacles that are going to slow you down all the way through your training. And then the other one is what I call a fortified building. So a lot of times we'll do training for urban operations, and we'll have people inside the building, and then we'll use our infantry because we can't simulate what the tank's actually going to do to the building. We'll use our infantry, and they'll try to get close to the building, and then they'll go into the building, and they'll have a real quick, real fast shootout, and then they'll move on to the next building. That's not reality, and not what I've seen in urban warfare, or what we see in urban warfare. Is that there's always these buildings that the enemy decides are going to be strong points, fortified structures that could take you days to deal with, could take you battalions in battles like the battle of so many different battles, the Mawari battle, the Battle of Manila, where a single Stalingrad, you name it, a single building becomes a battle in itself, and you'll lose a lot of people trying to go into that building. Uh, I don't see that happening in training because we want the training to be fast and we want the infantry to train. They need to train what to do with a building that's being defended heavily inside the building, or just sand, bunkers inside the buildings. There's a battle that happened in the Battle of Manila. A whole battalion entered this one building, a fortified building, a university building, and had a full battle inside the building. And that's what we see, but we don't replicate that in urban warfare training, and I think it's a big mistake.
What about the learning tactics from ISIS and all of that? Having a true op for dedicated to knowing them and applying it. Because I mean, for what I know, at least in Spain, let's say some people tend to, they don't like such tactics being used in exercises because they consider them maybe, I don't know, unfair or something like that. What do you think about that? Is it necessary?
Yeah,
Is there a problem? We are applying them on our op force.
yeah, I agree with you there. That usually you see, even when you do have an op for, they're good bad guys. They're following the rules of armed conflict, like we were talking about, and not doing things that the
Good
enemy.
bad guys. I like
Yeah,
that
that's right.
concept. Yeah.
Yeah. I also say most of the training I go out and observe, and I haven't been to Spain to observe any training. People still imagine this counter-terrorist fight. So they imagine that they're going to enter the city in what we're going to call a permissive environment, so that on the way to the building, most everything is safe. They know exactly what building the enemy is in, and they're going to get there really fast, and they're going to strike really hard. That is an operation that we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it goes all the way back to 1972. This back when terrorism was on the rise, this ability to do these raids, what we call raids. So I see more training on raids where it's in a permissive environment and you just have one building of bad guys, not this citywide fight that even if you're fighting another peer adversary is going to happen. You're going to pay for every inch that you're going to take. That's a lot different when there's a threat 360 degrees around you. So snipers is the other thing, Yago. I very rarely see people training urban snipers, it's in every battle you ever look at in urban warfare history. I never see a good op for inside cities playing urban snipers that are effective, and that there's really, so what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about a lot of snipers? And we saw in the battles of Syria in the Middle East, remote controlled snipers, right? So electronic positions. There's nobody there. It's controlled by somebody in a different location, or a sniper that's shooting through multiple buildings, through the holes that they created. Um, I rarely see people training that reality aspect of it, but it's 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 getting armies to believe what the battle that they're actually going to fight, because they're preparing for a very short a mission. And this is what I talk about a lot in my studies, right? So fighting in cities is huge. There's so much you must know, and there's so many different missions you could get. Uh, it needs a lot more people doing it, like preparing for it and training for it and studying it, because there's so many different variations, and there's no city that's the same, right? So Mosul is a very unique city. I mean, in some aspects, you could say there's many cities that have this old, very old core, very dense. Whether it's a Casbah or you
Mm,
name it, European cities of a central area, and it
yeah.
changes.
Strong
And
walls,
yeah,
stone. Yeah.
yeah, but every city is different. It really is. So that ability to train for those differences and just the way the city, that's another big problem in our military. Is we always assume in our training that, okay, I'm going to move from the outside the city and I'm going to get inside the city and then I'm going to start fighting. Cities have changed, so you're going to have to fight to get into the city, uh, and 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 that takes different type of resources, a different type of plan. And we have seen in history how you can use deception operations to mask what you're actually doing, right? What I always tell people when I visit training is, don't fight this the exact way that the enemy thinks you're going to fight it. But that's what we do. We always surround the city, and then we're going to penetrate into the city. I'm going to get to a building. We call it a foothold, and I'm going to start clearing building, building, building. Well, that's exactly the way the enemy wants you to do it. And so it's
All
gonna
right.
be really hard.
Yeah, he's getting prepared for that exactly. I'm remembering the Simon Nabe, the Israeli systemic operational design, I think.
Yes, yes, yeah,
Yes, who? Yeah, I don't remember how it was. Yeah, but how they saw the city as as worms, if I don't
that's
remember
right.
bad.
Yeah, a lot of people quote that, and I went there actually this last summer to further look at it. And I will say in there, so that goes all the way back to like 2002, the Second Intifada, the battles of like Jenin and Nablus. This concept of what do they call it? Infestation. Yes, of
Oh,
never.
you even learn their language.
Yeah, even, and I will say in their culture today is still this tactic of not doing what the enemy wants you to do, which is be on the streets and the alleyways, because that's where the snipers can hit you. That's where they can just shoot, and they don't have to be good. So in the Israeli military, all their training bases have holes in the walls, and not just on the outside of buildings, but inside the buildings. They want to really practice going through the city, through the buildings, and the U.S. military does not do that, and maybe they should, but it isn't a different way. There's problems with the tactic and the ability to do it and the speed that you want to do it, but I think it's amazing. And if you look at the where people die, yeah, they die in the streets and the alleyways. You also need the ability, though, like I said, to face an enemy who's in a building and he knows he's going to die inside that building. What do? Do you just back up and blow the building up? Uh, what are your different ways, right? So this the thing that all militaries have a problem because they remember something is this what we call a close quarters battle, right? So this four soldiers on the outside of a door preparing to go inside the door, and they clear the room in a very specific way. It's very tactical, but it's the problem is that works very well in one context. That will never work in a high intensity combat fight like Mosul and Mawari, things like that. You better shoot at the building with a tank. You better have the ability to come in a different direction. If you come through the door, you're dead. You come through and there's all kinds of examples in history of doing it differently. So in training, we need to train soldiers to do it many ways. given the context and the situation they're facing. And like you said, have the op forward change the situation where every door is a bomb. And it's what we saw in the Battle of Fallujah and the Battle of Mosul. You're not going through the door. That's exactly where the enemy thinks you're going to come. It's a bomb on the door. So you better, okay, now what are you going to do?
Now, you speak about those terrorists, those ISIS guys trying to, willing to die. Yeah. So I was thinking, what about? I don't want this to look like a First World War debate, but what about morale and will? What's the paper of it? I'm remembering maybe how the Americans took Baghdad in 2003, right? And how this fought in, how this battle at Mosul happened. And the Iraqi army, maybe low morale, and they dissolved it very rapidly, while ISIS has, I don't know, what's the paper from your point of view of will and morale in this kind of modern battles?
Great question. Yeah, of course, will is still the leading proponent of any war, and in a battle is the will of both your enemy, the will of your own soldiers, the will of your population, and the will of your political leaders. They're all still important in any moment of time in the battle. And like you said, so ISIS, there's always fanatical soldiers, right? No matter what you do, you're not going to change the will of them before you show up. They want to die is part of their objective, and you have to have the ability to do that. I will say that there were many operations, even in this campaign against ISIS, where the will of the enemy was attacked in very successfully in like information operations campaigns. If you look at like the Battle of Fallujah and the Battle of Tal Afar, the messaging of the Iraq military to the ISIS fighters, because some of them were Iraqis, let's face it, the messaging did work, and many of them did walk away, and we saw that. So that's always a campaign in the battle. But if you have, in some aspects, like that will get you so far, and then you still have fighters that no matter what you do before, no matter who you are, they're still going to fight, right? So the one of the problems with using the fight for Baghdad in 2003 is that the city wasn't well defended, and the Iraqi, many of the Iraqi army did walk away.
Well defended or willingly defended?
It was not well defended, as in there wasn't a big fight. So some people gain a different lesson than I think they should in the way the future will happen. That it'll be an easy fight if you bring the right forces. Now, the Iraqi units in Mosul, like I said, they had been fighting for a long time before the Battle of Mosul. One of the issues is that we built the Iraqi, the U.S. coalition, U.S. military coalition built the Iraqi army in our vision. So did we build them to be able to fight urban battles is a strong question that I have. Whether we even train for urban battles. So what you saw is that the most elite formation in the Iraqi state, the counterterrorism service, was the main unit used. So it was amazing fighters, highly trained counter-terrorist fighters, trained in urban fighting, but in those raids that I was talking about, they had no clue how to do combined arms breaches of obstacles in cities, how to fight with tanks, how to fight with in this dense urban fight against a defender. And a lot of them died because of that, because they're great fighters and they had the will and they were going to do it no matter how they were trained. I think one of the major lessons for all of us is the Iraqi military did not have an organization trained for that operation, which was to take back a defended city, to take a city. They were trained to fight in the open. They were trained like us, the U.S. military and most Western militaries, to fight in all environments. And I think that's crazy. If I'm the Iraq government, I'm going to build people that can fight in cities. I'm going to build formations who can take back cities very rapidly if I need them to. Hopefully they've learned that lesson now. I don't know. Arguably, that will of their forces was a major component. You saw there in the Battle of Mosul. I think if you read the article, they had to stop for at multiple points and for weeks just to build back their forces, give them replacements, uh, basically had to stop the momentum of the fight because they didn't have units trained to fight urban or at the intensity of the urban fight that you're going to need. There, I think those lessons are in there, but man, the counterterrorism service has paid such a high price because they were this highly trained force of you need motivated soldiers, but they were so untrained, unequipped for high intensity urban combat, right? And I think you know about the tank, right? So in this battle of Mosul, the tanks who were also not trained in urban fighting, they lost, especially the 9th Armored Division, lost so many tanks that the Iraqi government said you can no longer use tanks in this battle, especially in the main battle area. So now you have more infantry soldiers dying because the government said you can't have tanks in this fight because you've lost almost the national supply of tanks. I won't have any tanks left. It gets to this need to train combined arms urban fighting with armor, with engineers, all of that. So you saw a decision during this battle, which I disagree with strongly, that the Iraqi government said no more tanks in the main battle area. So what they did is they lost a lot more soldiers because of that decision.
What a political interference and wow.
Yeah, yeah,
Now,
which is militaries have to be prepared for, right? So that's history
yeah,
too, right? I don't want the politicians involved in my fight. It's a political fight.
yeah, that's absolutely true, right? Maybe the politicians have the reasons to. But okay, so one last question for the last 4 minutes. You speak about how they use counter-terrorism forces to clean the city to fight that urban battle. And I've heard you a few times saying something, if I remember correctly, that this urban fighting is not just about cleaning rooms, right?
That's right.
So, what can you tell us? What can you? How can you explain the audience why urban warfare is not just about cleaning buildings? We could say.
Yeah. So in order to have an urban fight, you have to have three things. You have to have uh, physical buildings. You have to have what we call people, populations. If it's not an urban fight, if it's just a bunch of empty buildings, you have to have people there. That's why urban fighting's have, and then you have to have infrastructure, which is like the water supplies and all these everything that would. All three of those parts are involved in urban fighting in some way. Most people don't even think about it. They just build fake buildings and then train entering and clearing them out. That's not urban warfare. That's a very, very narrow aspect of urban warfare. Like we've been talking about, the fight to get just to move around in the city, right? So just to be able to maneuver and get your forces into the city is a huge part of urban warfare that few people train, especially with their engineers, what we call mobility and counter mobility. They don't bring their engineers into their training events. They just say, okay, we're gonna just simulate that. You get to the building and start fighting, and let's practice clearing this room out. And the problem with this whole, well, we'll just get to that clearing part, is that it's not going to go like that. Are you going to enter with a grenade first? Can you see inside the building? If you just send four guys into a door and don't know what's in a room, that usually ends really badly, despite all the training we do. So there's so many more aspects to training for these types of fighting that we do in the woods. And we know it, and we practice it all in the woods. But when we get into city fighting, for some reason, okay, we're going to practice entering rooms and clearing out rooms. That's just not the reality of fighting that I go around and I tell everybody. Even I wrote a whole paper about crossing the street. So in urban fighting, we just assume that the guy's going to run across the street. Like we were talking about, there's other ways to do it. Usually we practice, you're going to throw a smoke grenade, which lasts for about 30 seconds if you know what you're doing. If not, you're running across the street where there's usually going to be somebody shooting at you. But that's the state of our urban fighting today, is that, right, if you don't have the tank there to protect you, you're just going to send a bunch of people running across the street. So it's one of the biggest challenges that we never talk about, but is despite all of our artificial intelligence and robots and all this stuff, becomes one of the biggest challenges of urban fighting today is crossing the street.
Such a simple thing. Wow. Really, Mr. Spencer, thank you very much. I hope we had more time, but it has been really joyful for me. Thank you very much for being with us, or answering all my questions, good and bad ones. That's it. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Iago. It's a great honor to be with you.
Thank you very much. So, John Spencer del Modern War Institute, os recomiendo ver lo que escribe allí, son cosas interesantísimas, todo guerra urbana, que es apasionante. Y nada, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros, dejaré los subtítulos ahora y hasta ahora. See you, bye bye, goodbye everyone.
Goodbye.